Begin with the arrest of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife. The couple made their first court appearance in New York today after their dramatic capture over the weekend by U.S. forces. Jared Hill is outside the federal courthouse with details on the proceedings and the expected legal challenges going forward.
In shackles and prison garb, deposed Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro appeared in Manhattan federal court. "I'm innocent. I am not guilty. I am a decent man," he said through an interpreter, adding, "I am the constitutional president of my country." Sitting with his wife, Celia Flores, they each pleaded not guilty to 4 federal charges, including conspiracy to import cocaine and machine guns, and conspiracy to commit narco-terrorism. Outside, hundreds of demonstrators gathered, some arguing against U.S. action in Venezuela, others celebrating Maduro's removal.
What's up, guys? Welcome back. Adam is here. In a Manhattan courtroom, star witness Hugo Carvajal, the former Venezuelan intelligence chief expected to prove Maduro was running a narco state, began to testify. And within minutes, the legal foundation of Trump's Venezuela operation started to crumble. His testimony was supposed to be the knockout blow, but it unraveled instead. But something went terribly wrong. Instead of delivering the testimony that would cement Trump's legacy as the president who finally took down the Venezuelan regime, Carvajal did something that nobody in the courtroom expected. He flipped. He turned on his handlers, he stood up in front of a federal judge, and admitted that everything he had told the U.S. government, everything that had been used to justify the military strikes, everything that had been presented as irrefutable evidence of Maduro's criminal enterprise was a fabrication. And not just a small exaggeration or a slight embellishment. He said the whole thing was a setup.
We're going to begin with the dramatic first court appearance by Nicolas Maduro right here in New York City. Venezuela's former leader and his wife arrived from a Brooklyn jail under very heavy guard yesterday. Both pled not guilty, with Maduro at times appearing defiant, using the hearing as a platform. Our chief correspondent, Matt Gutman, was there. Who's going to bring us the latest this morning. Matt, good morning to you.
Hey, good morning, Gail. Arraignments are typically short and procedural. This was different, with Maduro insisting at one point that he is an innocent man, that he was kidnapped, and that he is still the legal president of Venezuela. The judge interrupting him, saying, "I just need to know if you understand your rights and the charges against you." Shackled and shuffling in those jail khakis beside his escort of at least a dozen federal agents, the former president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife, Celia Flores, were choppered from the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, then loaded into this armored van for their first trip to this Manhattan federal courthouse.
The CIA had coached him on what to say. The evidence had been manufactured. The cocaine manifests had been inflated. The cartel narrative had been scripted specifically to create a legal pretext for military intervention. And the real goal, according to his testimony, was never about stopping drugs or bringing criminals to justice. It was about seizing Venezuelan oil fields and toppling a government that had become inconvenient to American interests. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Prosecutors looked like they had been physically struck. Defense attorneys scrambled to adjust their strategies. Journalists frantically typed notes, trying to capture every word of the bombshell testimony that was unfolding in real time. And somewhere in Mar-a-Lago, watching it all unfold on Fox News, Donald Trump was reportedly losing his mind. This was supposed to be his victory lap, his moment of triumph, the validation of everything he had been telling the American people about the need to intervene in Venezuela. Instead, he was watching his entire legal justification collapse in spectacular fashion, broadcast live to millions of viewers, who were suddenly forced to confront the possibility that they had been lied to about one of the most significant military operations in recent memory.
Venezuelan president has made his first appearance in front of a US judge charged with drugs and weapons offences. Nicolas Maduro transported from his Brooklyn jail cell to the New York federal courthouse alongside his wife, Celia Flores. Shackled at the ankles, both the ousted president and the First Lady pleaded not guilty. It marks the beginning of a lengthy legal battle. Rob, it's just wrapped up. What more do we know?
Morning, Marley. Well, look, yeah, it has just wrapped up. It was a pretty brief court appearance for both Nicolas Maduro and his wife. From top to bottom, lasting only about 40 minutes or so, pretty procedural. As soon as Maduro got up in front of the judge today, he began telling him how he was kidnapped from his home by US commandos in Venezuela a couple of days ago, but the judge cut him off, saying that there's going to be plenty of time to talk about that later. He asked him to identify himself, which he did, And then Maduro said, quote, "I'm innocent, I'm not guilty, I am a decent man."
The timing could not have been more brutal for the administration. Just 2 days before Carvajal's testimony, Judge Hellerstein had already dealt a devastating blow to the government's case by ruling that the raid itself had been illegal under international law. That ruling had sent shockwaves through the Justice Department. But there was still hope that the underlying intelligence would hold up, that even if the operation had been conducted improperly, the threat it was responding to was real. Carvajal's testimony vaporized that hope entirely. He was not just saying the operation was illegal, he was saying the very premise of the operation was based on a lie. The intelligence that had been used to justify military strikes into a sovereign nation had been deliberately fabricated to create the appearance of a threat that didn't actually exist. Think about the implications of that for a moment. If what Carvajal was saying was true, and given that he was under oath in federal court with everything to lose, it seemed increasingly likely that it was. Then the United States had launched a full-scale military invasion based on false intelligence. 27 civilians had died in those strikes, and now the world was learning that the justification for those deaths was manufactured.
One of the most audacious military moves in US history. American armed forces striking Venezuela and capturing the country's leader, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife.
All Venezuelan military capacities were rendered powerless as the men and women of our military, working with U.S. law enforcement, successfully captured Maduro in the dead of night.
Dubbed Operation Absolute Resolve, the unprecedented assault involved the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines and FBI, and the use of drones, helicopters, bombs and an engineered blackout across the nation's capital, Caracas.
They were completely overwhelmed and very quickly incapacitated.
That's not a political scandal. That's a potential war crime. That's the kind of thing that gets referred to international tribunals and haunts administrations for decades. And the details that Carvajal was spilling were devastating in their specificity. He described how CIA handlers had coached him to inflate his testimony, telling him exactly what to say and how to say it to make the case against Maduro as compelling as possible. He described fake cocaine manifests and bribed officials and manipulated intelligence reports. He described a process where the intelligence was tailored to fit a predetermined narrative rather than the other way around. The man who was supposed to be the star witness against Maduro was now testifying that there were no direct orders from the Venezuelan leader linking him to drug operations. The whole Cartel de los Soles narrative, the dramatic name that had been used to justify the intervention, was exaggerated almost beyond recognition, according to Carvajal. The connections that had been presented as irrefutable evidence of state-sponsored drug trafficking were actually tenuous and circumstantial, manipulated by CIA handlers to sound more damning than they really were. And in the process, Carvajal was directly implicating senior Trump administration officials. He testified that Rubio and Hegseth had bypassed normal extradition procedures because the goal was never about bringing criminals to justice. The goal was regime change, and the drug trafficking narrative was just the justification. The scope of the military operation that Carvajal described was staggering. Over 150 U.S. aircraft had been involved in the strikes, including F-35 stealth fighters and B-1 bombers. They had created a no-fly zone over Venezuelan territory, cleared Venezuelan air defenses, and conducted what amounted to a full-scale invasion under the guise of a law enforcement operation. One helicopter had been hit, but there were 0 U.S. casualties, a testament to the overwhelming force that had been brought to bear. And yet, despite all that military might, despite all the planning and preparation, despite all the intelligence that was supposed to justify the operation, the whole thing was built on a foundation of sand. A federal judge had already ruled it illegal, and now the star witness was testifying that the intelligence used to authorize it was fabricated. Trump's response to all of this was telling. He didn't deny the specifics of what Carvajal was saying. He didn't argue with the account of the operation or try to present a different version of events. Instead, he did what he always does when confronted with uncomfortable truths. He attacked the messenger. He called Carvajal a traitor. He claimed without evidence that Democrats had bought him off. He went on Fox News and insisted that the U.S. was still running Venezuela, as if sheer assertion could somehow override the devastating testimony that was now part of the public record. But the problem with that approach was that it didn't address the substance of what Carvajal had said. It didn't explain why the intelligence had been fabricated. It didn't explain why the operation had been conducted outside of normal legal channels. It didn't explain why 27 civilians had died based on evidence that was now being admitted as false. It was just noise, and the noise was getting harder and harder to hear over the growing chorus of voices demanding answers. The parallels to other historical scandals were impossible to ignore. This had all the hallmarks of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where exaggerated or fabricated intelligence was used to justify military escalation in Vietnam. It had echoes of the Iraq War, where the existence of weapons of mass destruction was asserted with certainty, despite intelligence that was far more ambiguous than the public was told. And it had the unmistakable feel of the Iran-Contra affair, where the administration had operated outside legal boundaries to achieve political objectives. Each of those scandals had damaged presidencies, had led to investigations and hearings and lasting damage to public trust. But this was potentially worse because it was happening in real time, with the American people watching every development unfold, with court testimony that couldn't be walked back or explained away, with a federal judge's ruling that provided independent verification that something had gone terribly wrong. The political fallout from Carvajal's testimony was immediate and savage. Within hours of his appearance in court, Republican members of Congress who had supported the Venezuela operation were scrambling to create distance. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who had been one of Trump's most vocal defenders on virtually every issue, was now citing the testimony as evidence of what she called a perjury cover-up. Rand Paul was demanding investigations, calling for hearings that would examine how the intelligence had been fabricated and who had authorized its use. 31 House Republicans had announced they were not seeking re-election, a number that was stunning in its size and spoke to the fear that was gripping the party. This wasn't normal attrition. This was a mass exodus, people getting off a sinking ship before it went down completely. The Democratic response was equally swift and far more unified than anything they had managed in years. They were already talking about adding the Venezuela operation to their impeachment articles, arguing that the use of fabricated intelligence to justify military action was exactly the kind of high crime and misdemeanor that the founders had in mind when they created the impeachment process. War crimes referrals were being prepared for the International Criminal Court. Calls for special prosecutors were growing louder by the hour, and everywhere the message was the same. This wasn't about policy differences or political strategy. This was about fundamental questions of whether a president could launch military operations based on fabricated intelligence. That wasn't a partisan question. It was a constitutional one, and Democrats were increasingly confident that they had the evidence to make their case. The economic consequences were just as devastating. Oil prices had surged 25% in the days following Carvajal's testimony, as global markets reacted to the chaos that was engulfing Venezuela. While Trump had been insisting that the U.S. was running the country, the reality on the ground was far different. Venezuelan oil production had effectively stopped, as international companies refused to do business there, while the legal status of the government remained in question. Chinese and Russian interests were circling, offering deals that would give them preferential access to Venezuelan resources, and the Trump administration was powerless to stop it because its entire legal justification for the intervention had collapsed. The result was that Americans were paying more at the pump because of Trump's adventure, a direct line from the administration's actions to increased costs for ordinary voters. Political scientists would later note that this was kryptonite for any administration. The combination of a foreign policy disaster and economic pain that voters could directly attribute to the president's decisions. The legal implications were even more profound. Carvajal wasn't just saying the intelligence was fabricated, he was providing specific details about how it happened. He described a process where CIA handlers would feed him information and tell him exactly how to present it. He described how fake cocaine manifests were created and how shipment numbers were inflated. He described how manufactured connections were created between Maduro and drug trafficking operations that didn't actually exist. And he was doing all of this in a federal courtroom, under oath, with cross-examination looming and the full weight of the legal system pressing down on him. This wasn't a press conference or a leaked document or an anonymous source. This was sworn testimony from a cooperating witness who was now asking for witness protection because of the death threats he was receiving. That last detail was crucial. Carvajal was under no illusions about what he had done. He knew that by testifying against the operation, he had made himself a target. He knew that there were people who would kill him for what he had revealed. And yet he was still doing it, still standing up in court and telling the truth. Still cooperating with investigators who were now looking into how the intelligence had been fabricated and who had authorized its use. That was not the behavior of someone who had been bought off or who was acting out of political motivation. That was the behavior of someone who had seen something terrible and felt compelled to reveal it, whatever the personal cost. The sealed plea agreement that had been signed back in November was now being scrutinized in a whole new light. At the time, it had seemed like a standard cooperation deal, the kind of arrangement that prosecutors make all the time with high-level insiders who can provide testimony against bigger targets. But in retrospect, there were warning signs that the agreement had been rushed, that the evidence Carvajal was providing was too perfectly tailored to fit the administration's narrative, that there were inconsistencies and gaps that should have been investigated more thoroughly. Now those warning signs looked like red flags, indicators that something was fundamentally wrong with the entire prosecution, and the Justice Department was left to explain how they had been fooled, or worse, how they had participated in the fabrication themselves. The Panama parallels that legal scholars were drawing were not accidental. In 1989, the United States had invaded Panama to arrest Manuel Noriega on drug charges, and while the operation had succeeded in the narrow sense of capturing the target, it had been internationally condemned and had set dangerous precedents. Everyone knew the real reason for the invasion was about controlling the canal and removing a leader who had become inconvenient. The drug charges were just the justification, a legal fig leaf for what was essentially an act of war. And now, decades later, the same playbook was being used again, except this time, the star witness was admitting the whole thing was fabricated before the case even got to trial. The damage to American credibility was incalculable, and the consequences for international law would be felt for years to come. Trump's defenders were left with increasingly desperate arguments. Some insisted that even if the specific intelligence used to justify the operation had been exaggerated, the underlying threat from Venezuela was real, and the intervention was justified. Others claimed that Carvajal was lying now, that he had been turned by the Democrats or was seeking to minimize his own culpability in the Venezuelan regime's crimes. But neither argument was particularly persuasive. The first collapsed under the weight of the evidence, because if the specific intelligence was fabricated, the government couldn't claim the threat was real without producing independent verification. And the second was undercut by the fact that Carvajal was testifying under oath in federal court with everything to lose. Lying now would only expose him to additional charges and would destroy any chance he had of getting a reduced sentence. His self-interest was aligned with telling the truth, which made his testimony all the more credible. The role of Rubio and Hegseth in the affair was also coming under increasing scrutiny. According to Carvajal's testimony, they had bypassed normal extradition procedures, the slow and bureaucratic but legally legitimate way to arrest a foreign leader on criminal charges. Instead, they had used inflated drug intelligence as a pretext to launch a military operation. This was a direct allegation of misconduct by senior administration officials, and it raised serious questions about what they had known and when they had known it. Had they genuinely believed the intelligence was accurate? Had they deliberately fabricated it? Or had they simply been willing to accept whatever justification was necessary to achieve their policy objectives? Any of those possibilities was damaging, but the most likely scenario, based on the evidence that was emerging, was that they had known the intelligence was questionable and had chosen to proceed anyway. The 2026 midterm elections were already beginning to take shape in the shadow of this scandal, and the implications for Republicans were dire. Democrats now had a simple and devastating message. Republicans supported an illegal war based on fake intelligence, and when they found out it was fake, they tried to cover it up. This was a narrative that wrote itself, and it was backed up by court testimony and judicial rulings. The ads would write themselves, showing Trump bragging about running Venezuela, followed by Carvajal testifying that the intelligence was fabricated, followed by a simple question. Did they know it was fake, or did they just not care? Either answer was terrible for Republicans trying to hold their seats, and the mass retirement of 31 House members suggested that they knew it too. The International Criminal Court referrals were another dimension of the scandal that was only beginning to unfold. The United States did not recognize the ICC's jurisdiction over American citizens, a position that had been bipartisan for decades, but the fact that war crimes referrals were being prepared was still deeply damaging. It meant that international legal scholars were concluding that the operation had violated the Geneva Conventions, that there was a credible case that crimes against humanity had been committed. And while the U.S. government could refuse to cooperate with the ICC, it couldn't stop the referrals from being made or the international condemnation that would follow. Trump's ability to travel overseas would be severely restricted. The U.S. would lose moral authority on issues of international law, and America's adversaries would have a propaganda gift that they would use for years. The national security establishment was in turmoil. Career intelligence professionals who had always insisted that their work was based on facts and evidence were now facing questions about whether they had been complicit in fabricating intelligence. Some had clearly been involved in the process of coaching Carvajal and tailoring his testimony. Others had been misled by their colleagues. And still others were simply trying to figure out how to do their jobs in an environment where the president was willing to use fabricated intelligence to justify military action. The implications for intelligence gathering and analysis were profound. If the public couldn't trust the intelligence community to tell the truth, then every assessment, every warning, every piece of analysis would be viewed with suspicion. And that would make it much harder to build support for necessary national security measures in the future. The Venezuelan people were caught in the middle of this disaster, as they had been for years. The hopes that had been raised by the promise of regime change had been dashed, replaced by chaos and uncertainty. Oil production had essentially stopped, the economy was in freefall, and there was no clear path forward. Some were clinging to the hope that the international community would step in to stabilize the situation, but that seemed increasingly unlikely given the legal cloud that now hung over the U.S. intervention. Others were trying to find ways to negotiate their own futures, seeking deals with the Chinese, the Russians, or anyone else who could offer some stability. And many were just trying to survive, to find food and water and medicine in a country that had been pushed to the brink of collapse. Trump's response to the crisis had been characteristically erratic. He had started by attacking Carvajal as a traitor, then shifted to insisting that the U.S. was still running Venezuela, then tried to change the subject to other issues where he felt more confident. But nothing worked. The story kept growing, kept taking on new dimensions, kept revealing new layers of misconduct. Every day brought new revelations, new questions, new demands for accountability. And Trump was increasingly isolated, with even his most loyal supporters beginning to distance themselves as the legal and political consequences became too dangerous to ignore. The House Judiciary Committee was already preparing for what promised to be the most consequential impeachment hearings since Nixon. They were gathering testimony, subpoenaing documents, interviewing witnesses. The scope of their investigation was enormous, covering not just the Venezuela operation, but the entire pattern of Trump's behavior. The lies, the manipulation, the disregard for law and constitution. Democrats were determined to make the case that Trump was unfit for office, that he had violated his oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And they believed they had the evidence to prove it. The challenge was building a case that could withstand the political attacks that would inevitably come, that could convince enough Republicans to join with Democrats to remove the president from office. The parallels to Nixon were impossible to ignore. Both presidents had been caught using national security justifications to cover up misconduct. Both had insisted they were innocent while the evidence mounted against them. Both had seen their support erode as the facts became clear, and both had faced the prospect of impeachment and removal. The difference was that Nixon had eventually chosen to resign, recognizing that he had lost the support needed to continue. Trump had shown no such inclination, no willingness to accept responsibility or acknowledge wrongdoing. He was fighting every step of the way, attacking the investigators, the judges, the witnesses, anyone who threatened his grip on power. And that made the outcome more uncertain, more likely to be resolved through political struggle rather than legal process. The economic consequences of the scandal were becoming more severe by the day. Oil prices had surged 25%, and there were signs that the chaos was spreading to other markets. Investors were nervous, uncertain about what would happen next. The dollar was weakening, and there were whispers of a broader economic downturn if the crisis continued. Trump had always claimed that his economic policies were working, that he had created the greatest economy in history. Now that claim was being undermined by the very operation that was supposed to demonstrate his strength and resolve. The irony was almost too perfect. A president undone by his own ambition, brought down by the very operation that was supposed to cement his legacy. The weeks and months ahead would be brutal for everyone involved. There would be more hearings, more testimony, more revelations. The legal process would grind on, slow and relentless, exposing more of what had happened and who had been responsible. The political battle would be vicious, with both sides using every tool at their disposal to win. And through it all, the American people would be watching, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to understand how their government had launched a military operation based on fabricated intelligence. It would not be easy. The truth was too complicated and the stakes too high for simple answers. But one thing was already clear. The Trump administration's Venezuela adventure had been a catastrophic failure, and the consequences would be felt for years to come. Hugo Carvajal remained in witness protection, cooperating with investigators who were trying to piece together the full story of what had happened. He was a flawed witness, a man who had participated in a corrupt regime and had initially lied to the U.S. government. But his testimony was now central to the investigation, and his willingness to tell the truth about what had happened was helping to unravel the conspiracy that had led to the military strikes. He was also a reminder of the human cost of the operation, the 27 civilians who had died, the families who would never see their loved ones again, the country that had been pushed to the brink of collapse. Those deaths had been based on lies, and the perpetrators had yet to be held accountable. The midterm elections were approaching, and the political landscape was shifting in ways that few had predicted. Democrats were gaining momentum, their message of accountability and honesty resonating with voters who were tired of the chaos. Republicans were in disarray, their leaders scrambling to distance themselves from the president while trying to maintain their base's support. Independent voters were moving away from Trump, their concerns about his competence and honesty reinforced by the daily revelations of misconduct. And everywhere, the question was the same. How had this happened? How had the President of the United States been allowed to launch a military operation based on fabricated intelligence? And what could be done to ensure that it never happened again? The Venezuela operation exposed deep failures in intelligence and executive decision-making, demanding fundamental reforms and a renewed commitment to truth and the rule of law. The lies are now out, and the American people will ultimately decide what accountability looks like.